Giovanni Padovani. Giovanni Padovani looked like he belonged on a GQ cover, not just a team sheet. A central defender with a modelling side gig, he seemed to have the perfect Italian life. He was a grinder in the lower leagues, fighting for every centimetre with clubs like Sanctaldes in Serie D. He wasn't a superstar playing under the bright lights of the San Siro, but he was a respected pro, making a living in the trenches of Italian football. But while he played defence on the field, he was playing a sick game of offence in his personal life. His relationship with 56-year-old Alessandra Mateu wasn't just rocky. It was a nightmare of control and obsession. She had already reported him for stalking, but as we see too often in these cases, a restraining order is just a piece of paper to a man who refuses to hear the word no. In August 2022, Padovani told his club he had personal matters to handle and flew to Bologna. It wasn't a visit, it was a hunt. He waited in the shadows of Alessandra's apartment lobby. When she walked in, the handsome footballer facade dropped and the monster came out. It was a brutal, calculated ambush. He came armed with a hammer and a baseball bat. He beat her relentlessly. And when the weapons weren't enough, he grabbed a heavy wrought iron bench from the garden to finish the job. Neighbours heard the screams. Alessandra was actually on the phone with her sister when the attack started, but it was over before anyone could intervene. When the police arrived, Padovani hadn't even fled. He was still there, standing over the woman he claimed to love. The courts saw right through him. In 2024, the judge rejected any crime of passion defence and handed him a life sentence. It was ruled a cold act of ownership, not love. 1 minute, Padovani was stopping goals in Sicily. The next, he was locked away forever. He tried to control everything, and in the process, he lost the only freedom he had left. The man from nowhere. Rio Mavuba possesses a birth certificate that remains unique in the history of professional football. Where most documents list a specific hospital or city, his bears a strange, almost cinematic designation, born at sea. In March 1984, his parents were fleeing the brutality of the Angolan Civil War. Somewhere in the cold expanse of international waters, adrift on a small refugee boat, Mavuba entered the world. Because he was born outside of any nation's jurisdiction, he was born without a country. For the next 20 years, Mavuba was stateless. Although he was raised in France and developed into a formidable midfielder, he existed in a legal void. He technically belonged nowhere. He held no passport, only a travel document for refugees. This made his early career a logistical minefield. Even as he became one of the best prospects in the league, he was ineligible for national selection. While his teammates breezed through customs for European fixtures, Mavuba faced endless scrutiny and red tape just to cross a border. The uncertainty only ended in 2004 when he was finally granted French citizenship. The transformation was profound. He went from a legal ghost to the captain of Lille and a key figure for Les Bleus. His career culminated at the World Cup, marking the end of an impossible journey. The child born in the empty ocean had finally found a nation to fight for, Harry Maguire. Before he became a polarising figure at Old Trafford, Harry Maguire was the bedrock of England's defence and a player Manchester United trusted enough to make the world's most expensive defender with an £80 million transfer fee. Known for his aerial dominance and leadership, he had just finished a season as the club's captain. However, that reputation for reliability shattered in the early hours of August 21st, 2020, on the Greek island of Mykonos. What began as a family holiday spiralled into chaos outside a bar. According to police reports, when officers intervened to break up a brawl involving Maguire's entourage, the situation escalated violently. Police alleged that Maguire physically assaulted officers and, in a desperate panic, attempted to bribe them to release him, infamously asking, "Do you know who I am?" A court on the island of Syros quickly found him guilty of aggravated assault, resisting arrest, and repeated attempts of bribery. The judge handed down a sentence of 21 months in prison, suspended for 3 years. The prosecution detailed how Maguire kicked an officer in the leg and tried to buy his way out of trouble, claims Maguire vehemently denied in a tearful BBC interview. The consequences were immediate and severe. Gareth Southgate was forced to withdraw him from the England squad for the Nations League, and the Mykonos incident became a weapon for his critics. He was booed by fans across the country, and the psychological weight of the conviction coincided with a sharp decline in form that haunted his captaincy. Germany 7-1 Brazil. Belo Horizonte, 2014. This was intended to be a coronation. Brazil, the spiritual home of football, was hosting the World Cup, and the nation had turned the stadium into a sea of yellow, weeping during the anthem with religious fervour. The narrative was pre-written. The hosts would overcome the loss of Neymar to lift the trophy. But within 20 minutes, the sport of football seemed to completely fall apart. The German goals came with ruthless speed. Everything we knew about these teams vanished. Between the 23rd and 29th minutes, the German team scored 4 goals in a blur of brutal efficiency that resembled a training drill against mannequins. The scoreboard ticked over to 5-0 before most fans in the stadium could even process the second goal. The visceral details of that half hour remain haunting. The atmosphere in the Mineirão turned toxic fast. 60,000 fans went from screaming the national anthem to staring in total disbelief as Germany put 5 past them in the first half hour. Sami Khedira and Toni Kroos passed the ball with surgical indifference, dismantling the Brazilian defence as if they were ghosts. It was a massacre that defied professional logic. Years later, the scoreline 7-1 feels less like a match result and more like a typing error in the history books. To this day, it is remembered as the moment the most famous football nation on earth simply forgot how to play. World Cup 1978. On June 21st, 1978, the city of Rosario hosted a game that blurred the lines between sport and state operation. Argentina faced Peru with a specific, nearly impossible target. They needed to win by 4 clear goals to overtake Brazil and reach the World Cup final. A standard victory wouldn't be enough. The military dictatorship needed a massacre to validate their regime. The atmosphere was suffocating. Before kickoff, General Jorge Videla, accompanied by Henry Kissinger, personally walked into the Peruvian locker room. They framed it as a courtesy call regarding Latin American brotherhood, but the subtext was heavy. When a dictator enters your personal space minutes before a match, you understand the consequences of spoiling the party. On the field, the collapse was suspicious. Peru had been defensively rugged all tournament, yet they suddenly looked like amateurs. All eyes were on goalkeeper Ramon Quiroga, an Argentine by birth, who seemed bizarrely passive, allowing easy shots to roll past him. Argentina didn't just get 4, they walked in 6. Theories have swirled for decades, ranging from massive grain shipments sent to Lima to the unfreezing of Peruvian bank assets. While the junta got their distraction and the country celebrated, the rest of the world watched in horror. Brazil went home undefeated, but eliminated, victims of a match where the result felt negotiated in a backroom rather than earned on the grass. The ostrich meltdown. April 2015. Leicester City was fighting for its life near the bottom of the table, and manager Nigel Pearson was clearly feeling the heat. Press conferences are usually scripted affairs. Managers speak in safe cliches to keep the headlines boring. But on this night, Pearson didn't want to be boring. He wanted a fight. When journalist Ian Baker asked a fairly standard question about the criticism the squad was facing, Pearson didn't deflect. He stared the man down with genuine disdain and launched a personal dismantling. He called Baker stupid. He called him daft. Then he delivered the most bizarre insult in Premier League history. "I think you are an ostrich." The room froze. Pearson wasn't laughing. He accused the reporter of having his head in the sand, aggressively questioning his flexibility and intelligence while the cameras rolled. It was raw, uncomfortable bullying broadcast live to the nation. He mocked the reporter's competence and demanded respect while showing none. This wasn't mind games or a tactical distraction. It was the sound of a man cracking under the crushing weight of the relegation battle. Instead of answering a question, he turned the press room into a wildlife documentary, proving that when the pressure gets too high, even Premier League managers can lose their grip on reality. Nahuel Oviedo. On the pitch, Nahuel Oviedo was a bulldog. A stocky, aggressive forward, he knew how to use his frame to bully defenders and find the back of the net. He started his career with genuine promise at Huracan, a historic club in Buenos Aires. Making it in the Argentine Primera isn't just about skill, it's a dogfight where only the hungriest survive. And Oviedo definitely had the hunger. He looked like a player who could carve out a solid living in the rough and tumble world of South American football. But talent in Argentina often comes wrapped in volatility. Oviedo couldn't stick at the top level and began the slow slide down the pyramid to San Telmo in the gritty lower tiers. It became the classic journeyman story, fighting for contracts on the weekend and fighting his own demons during the week. The streets of Buenos Aires seemed to have a tighter grip on him than any locker room ever did. That aggression spilled over fatally in July 2018. Outside a nightclub in Hurlingham, a suburb west of the capital, a street brawl erupted. In a twisted irony, his opponent wasn't a random stranger. It was Facundo Espindola, a 25-year-old former goalkeeper for Almagro. It was striker versus keeper, but this time there was no referee, no ball, and no whistle to save them. The fight turned lethal in seconds. It started with the usual shoving and insults, toxic ego, spilling onto the pavement, but Oviedo escalated it instantly. He pulled a knife. In the chaos, he plunged the blade into Espindola's chest. The goalkeeper collapsed, bleeding out on the concrete, while the club music likely still thumped in the distance. Oviedo tried to flee in a white Peugeot, but the police weren't far behind. The courts showed zero mercy. In 2020, Oviedo was handed 14 years for homicide. The judge saw a man who brought a weapon to a fistfight and took a life over a drunken dispute. He spent his life trying to beat goalkeepers, but in his final act, he didn't just beat one, he killed him. 2 careers, 2 lives, destroyed in a split second of senseless rage. Santi Mina. Santi Mina was establishing himself as one of La Liga's most reliable forwards, a key striker for Valencia, and later Celta Vigo, who was known for his clinical finishing and high work rate. He was a player on the cusp of his prime, but that trajectory changed forever in June 2017 during a holiday in Mojácar, Almeria. A woman accused Mina of entering a camper van where she was staying and sexually abusing her. She testified that Mina entered the vehicle naked and assaulted her, despite her explicit rejection. The case hung over his head for nearly 5 years, a dark cloud that followed him, even as he continued to perform on the pitch. In May 2022, the Almeria Provincial Court delivered a crushing verdict. While he was cleared of sexual aggression, he was found guilty of sexual abuse. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison and issued a restraining order preventing him from approaching the victim for 12 years. The court flatly rejected the defence's claim of consent, relying on forensic evidence and the victim's testimony. The impact on his top-flight career was terminal. Celta Vigo immediately exiled him from the squad, opening disciplinary proceedings. A planned escape route to Italian side Sampdoria collapsed after their fans revolted against signing a convicted sex offender. With Europe closed off to him, Mina was eventually forced to the Saudi Pro League to find employment while his appeals process continued. The Headbutt. The 2006 World Cup final was scripted to be the glorious swan song of Zinedine Zidane, the greatest artist of his generation. He had already scored a Panenka penalty earlier in the match, playing with a serene, absolute confidence. As the game dragged into the fatigue of extra time, the world awaited a final moment of magic or a penalty shootout. The cameras were following the ball elsewhere when play suddenly stopped. The referee blew his whistle, not for a foul, but for a body lying on the turf. The confusion was absolute. There was no VAR, no stadium replay. Fans had no idea why Marco Materazzi was writhing on the ground. Then, the broadcast showed the angle that shocked the world. It wasn't a tackle at all. It was an act of cold, deliberate violence. Zidane, calm and deliberate, had turned and driven his head into Materazzi's chest. It was shocking. 1 minute, he's jogging back. The next, he's floored Materazzi. It didn't make any sense. The image of Zidane walking past the Golden World Cup trophy, head bowed, unlacing his gloves as he disappeared into the dark tunnel, is still considered the most haunting visual in football history. He didn't just lose his temper, he shattered his own fairy tale ending. It was a stark, brutal reminder that even gods are capable of human flaws, ending a legendary career not with a goal, but with a red card. France, Ireland, Paris, November 2009. The stakes were huge. A ticket to the World Cup in South Africa. Ireland, the underdogs, played the game of their lives, dragging a nervous French team into extra time at the Stade de France. They deserved to win, but the match was decided by a moment of cheating so blatant it stunned the world. A free kick floated into the box, and Thierry Henry, a player known for elegance, resorted to desperation. He handed the ball, not once, but twice to control it before squaring it to William Gallas for the winner. The Irish players were furious. They surrounded referee Martin Hansen, begging him to look at the replay screens. But the goal stood. It was a robbery committed in plain sight. Henry sat on the pitch afterward, looking more guilty than triumphant, while the Irish team realised their dream had been stolen by a hand. The scandal didn't end on the pitch. The Irish FA threatened legal action to block the World Cup. Years later, the dirty truth surfaced. FIFA had quietly paid the Irish Association €5 million to prevent a lawsuit. They labelled it a loan for stadium work, but the world saw it for what it was: hush money to bury the problem. France went to the World Cup, but karmic justice followed them. They imploded in a humiliating group stage exit that gave Irish fans a small, bitter sense of satisfaction. The captain who walked alone, Paolo Maldini, gave AC Milan 25 years, 902 matches, and 5 Champions League trophies. He was the definition of loyalty in a sport that rarely sees it. But when he took his final lap of honour around the San Siro in May 2009, the Ultras didn't cheer, they attacked. It was supposed to be a coronation, but it turned into an ambush. As he waved goodbye, the Curva Sud unfurled a massive banner that read, "There is only one captain." They weren't talking about him. They were honouring Franco Baresi, a calculated public attempt to erase Maldini's legacy in his final moments. They hadn't forgiven him for calling them mercenaries years earlier when they protested the team after a loss. He had refused to bow to them then, and they made him pay for it now. But the real knife in the back didn't come from the stands, it came from the owner's box. The club hierarchy stayed silent. No defence, no statement, no support. They let their greatest legend stand alone against the mob while the cameras rolled. Maldini didn't just retire that day, he exiled himself. He refused to step foot in the club's management for nearly a decade, rejecting every offer until the ownership changed completely. He wouldn't work for people who wouldn't protect him. He wasn't holding a grudge, he was holding a standard. Tony Varel. Tony Varel was the ultimate cult hero of 90s French football. You couldn't miss him, that trademark blonde mullet, and the socks rolled down to his ankles made him an icon. But he wasn't just a gimmick. He was the working class king of the North. He was the driving force behind RC Lens's legendary 1998 League One title. A powerhouse striker who bullied defenders and earned 8 caps for France, sharing the locker room with gods like Zidane and Henry. For a few golden years, Virels was a rock star, beloved for his grit as much as his flair. But gravity catches everyone. As the 2000s wore on, the goals dried up, and Virel drifted into a journeyman existence, bouncing between clubs like Bastia and Guignon. He was clinging to the game, trying to keep the fire alive in smaller stadiums. But the intense passion that made him a hero on the pitch translated into something volatile off it, specifically regarding his fierce loyalty to his clan, his family. By October 2011, the glory days were gone, replaced by the neon glare of a nightclub parking lot in Nancy. The incident at the Les 4 Aus nightclub started as a standard dispute. Varel's younger brothers were kicked out by bouncers. Most people would go home and sleep it off. The Varel's brothers went home and loaded up. They returned ready for war, rolling up with baseball bats and 3 different caliber guns. This wasn't a drunken scuffle, it was an armed assault. They opened fire on the security staff at the entrance, wounding 3 bouncers in a chaotic scene of totally disproportionate vengeance. The legal fallout was a slow burn, dragging on for over a decade, while Virel claimed innocence. But the courts eventually closed the net. In 2022, the former international star was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with 2 suspended for aggravated violence. He avoided a murder charge because the victim survived, but the intent was terrifyingly clear. The man who was once famous for firing shots past world-class goalkeepers ended his legacy by firing real bullets at working men. The mullet is gone, and the hero status is tarnished forever. John Villafara. John Villafara was once a national hero in Colombia. The midfielder, who played for Southampton and Portsmouth in the Premier League, famously scored a wonder goal to help Once Caldas win the Copa Libertadores in 2004. But after his retirement, he fell into the trap that ensnares many former players who miss the wealth of their playing days. In 2017, under the code name Operation Gideon, authorities identified him not as a footballer, but as a key logistics coordinator for the Gulf Cartel, organising speedboats to smuggle cocaine into Central America. Arrested in Cali and extradited to the US, Villafara faced a federal court in Texas in April 2021. He was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison for drug trafficking conspiracy. At his sentencing, he expressed regret, claiming he became involved because he was broke despite his previous earnings. His professional legacy was obliterated. Once the man who brought glory to Colombian football, he is now inmate number 09616-509 in a US federal prison. His case serves as a tragic warning in South America about the dangerous allure of narco-trafficking for retired athletes. The Danish fairy tale. Modern football is defined by meticulous preparation, data analysis, and diet regimes. The story of Denmark in 1992 flips this entirely on its head, playing out like a rejected movie script. The Danish team had not even qualified for the tournament. They were technically on vacation, scattered across the beaches of southern Europe, when civil war disqualified Yugoslavia. With barely a week's notice, the players were recalled from their holidays to compete against the most finely tuned squads on the continent. The illusion was that they would be cannon fodder, a team lacking fitness, strategy, or focus. Instead, they played with a liberated spirit that baffled their opponents. They scraped through the group stages before facing the reigning European champions, the Netherlands, and the world champions, Germany. Logic dictated they stood no chance. Yet, in the final, against a unified, powerful German side, Denmark didn't just survive. They dominated. John Jensen, a midfielder who rarely scored, fired a thunderbolt into the net. Peter Schmeichel seemed to grow physically larger in the goal, repelling every German attack. When the final whistle blew, the image of players who had been drinking cocktails 2 weeks prior, lifting the trophy, shattered the professional seriousness of the sport. It stands as the ultimate exception proof that sometimes chemistry and relaxation can dismantle the most sophisticated footballing systems in the world. Marseille versus Valenciennes, the 1993 scandal involving Olympique de Marseille, is the perfect example of how greed can destroy a football dynasty. Marseille was the undisputed king of French football, led by the charismatic and controversial Bernard Tapie. They were days away from the Champions League final against AC Milan, and Tapie was obsessed with ensuring his players arrived in Munich, injury-free and fresh. He didn't want a difficult domestic match against Valenciennes to jeopardise the European dream, so he decided to remove the risk entirely. Tapie's solution was to buy his way to a win. Through intermediaries, Marseille contacted Valenciennes players, including Christophe Robert, offering bribes to lift their foot and ensure they didn't tackle hard. The game played out exactly as planned, a gentle 1-0 win for Marseille, and 6 days later, they became the first French club to win the Champions League. However, the plot unravelled when police raided Robert's property and found 250,000 francs buried in his aunt's garden. The fallout was catastrophic. Marseille was stripped of their French league title, denied the right to defend their European crown, and forcibly relegated to the second division. Tapie went to prison, and the club's golden era turned to ash. The scandal proved that sometimes the biggest threat isn't the opposition striker, but a bribe in the boardroom. The Bernabeu mugging. On April 21st, 2009, Real Madrid hosted Getafe at the Santiago Bernabeu. The fixture held critical implications for the La Liga title race, but the athletic contest was overshadowed by an incident in the 87th minute. As Getafe midfielder Javier Casquero advanced into the penalty area, Real Madrid defender Pepe pushed him to the ground to concede a penalty. The sequence immediately escalated beyond the parameters of a sporting foul. Instead of accepting the referee's whistle, Pepe initiated a physical assault on the defenceless player. Broadcast footage documented the defender kicking Casquero twice in rapid succession. The video showed Pepe raking his boot studs across the opponent's back before striking another Getafe player, Juan Albin, in the face during the subsequent disorder. The aggression garnered immediate condemnation from match officials and observers alike. Following a review, the Spanish Football Federation handed down a 10-match suspension, recording one of the most severe disciplinary sanctions in the history of the modern competition. The suspension removed Pepe from the pitch, but the footage created a lasting legacy. For the remainder of his career, the assault on Casquero stood as the definitive reference point for his disciplinary record. The outburst demonstrated a level of volatility that critics argued separated his technical defensive skills from his temperament, permanently altering his standing in European football. Diego Buonanotte. Diego Buonanotte wasn't just small, he was microscopic for a modern athlete, standing barely 161 centimetres. But for River Plate, El Enano was a giant. He was the classic Argentine number 10 blueprint, shrunk down to pocket-size explosive, tricky, and impossible to catch. By 2008, he was literally on top of the world, standing on the podium in Beijing with an Olympic gold medal around his neck, celebrating alongside icons like Lionel Messi and Juan Román Riquelme. The big European clubs were circling, and the future wasn't just bright, it was blinding. But the road to stardom has dangerous curves, and for Buonanotte, the literal road ended his life as he knew it. It was December 26th, 2009. The holidays were in full swing, and Buonanotte was back home in Teodolina. He hopped into his father's Peugeot 307 with three of his childhood best friends, Gerardo, Alexis, and Emmanuel. They were just kids, really, heading out on a rainy morning, music playing, the world at their feet. Then came the storm. Driving along Route 65, the weather turned violent. The rain lashed down, turning the asphalt into a slip and slide. Buonanotte lost control. The car didn't just slide. It careened off the road and wrapped itself violently around a large tree. The impact was devastating. In a split second, the laughter stopped. When the metal stopped screeching, Buonanotte was the only one breathing. His three friends, the boys he grew up with, were killed instantly. Buonanotte was pulled from the wreckage alive but broken, suffering a fractured humerus and a bruised lung. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the legal and emotional storm that followed. Prosecutors came for him, charging the young star with triple manslaughter. The public debated, was it the rain or was it the driver? In the end, the court acquitted him, ruling it a tragic accident caused by treacherous conditions. Jermaine Pennant. Jermaine Pennant was a prodigious talent, signed by Arsenal as a teenager for a massive fee. However, by 2005, while on loan at Birmingham City, his discipline had completely unravelled. In the early hours of January 23rd, he was arrested after crashing his Mercedes-Benz into a lamppost in Aylesbury. When police found him, he was still in the driver's seat, dragging the lamppost underneath the car. In a panic, he famously identified himself as his friend Ashley Cole. Tests showed he was over the legal alcohol limit, and crucially, he was already driving while disqualified from a previous offence. On March 1st, 2005, the Aylesbury Magistrates Court sentenced him to 3 months in prison for drink driving, driving while disqualified, and driving without insurance. The magistrate stated there was no reasonable excuse for his actions. Pennant served 30 days before being released on parole, but he was required to wear an electronic monitoring tag. The fallout was unique in Premier League history. Birmingham City manager Steve Bruce chose to stand by him, and Pennant became the first player to play in a top-flight match, while wearing an electronic tag hidden under his sock. His career continued with moves to Liverpool and Stoke, but the bad boy image stuck with him permanently. Zambia. The 2012 African Cup of Nations final carried a weight far heavier than a standard sporting event. In 1993, the entire Zambian national team perished in a plane crash off the coast of Libreville, Gabon, wiping out a golden generation. 19 years later, by a twist of fate that feels almost too poetic, the 2012 final was held in Libreville, just miles from the crash site. Zambia, a team of journeymen, faced the Ivory Coast, a super team featuring Didier Drogba and Yaya Toure. The talent gap was astronomical. The atmosphere was thick with history. The Ivory Coast was vastly superior, yet they could not score. Didier Drogba, one of the world's most lethal strikers, skied a penalty in regulation time. The ball seemed to be repelled by an invisible force. The match drifted into a penalty shootout that defied all statistical probability, going deep into sudden death. When Stoppala Sunzu scored the winning penalty, the celebrations were defined less by pure joy and more by an heavy, eerie sense of closure. The Zambian players fell to their knees, singing to the ocean where their predecessors had died. It felt as though the spirits of the 1993 team had physically intervened to guide the ball. In a sport governed by money and tactics, this was a rare moment where the story felt more important than the sport, delivering a victory that seemed guided by the ghosts of the past. Paderborn, Hamburger SV, German football, prides itself on efficiency and rules. But in 2004, the DFB Pokal match between Paderborn and Hamburger SV shattered that illusion. This stands as the single biggest confirmed scandal in the modern era, centering entirely on referee Robert Heuser. Unlike other controversial matches fueled by incompetence, this was a calculated job executed for the Croatian betting mafia. Heuser didn't just make mistakes. He confessed to rigging the game from the start. Hamburg dominated early, cruising to a comfortable 2-0 lead. Then the script flipped. Heuser awarded a penalty to Paderborn for a foul that never happened, a call so baffling that even the opposition forwards looked confused. When Hamburg SV captain Emil Impenza demanded an explanation, he was immediately sent off for insulting the official. Down a man and fighting a corrupt referee, Hamburg collapsed. A second dubious penalty sealed the 4-2 upset, completing the fix. The motivation was painfully simple: greed. A betting syndicate had placed enormous wagers on the underdog, and Heuser received €67,000 and a flat-screen TV to ensure the payout. The ensuing investigation tore the league apart, revealing a network of corruption that forced the dub to pay Hamburg €1.5 million in compensation. The grip of terror. February 6th, 1988. Newcastle United against Wimbledon. On one side, you had Paul Gascoigne, a 20-year-old prodigy dazzling the league with his skill. On the other, Vinnie Jones, the designated hitman for the notorious Crazy Gang. Jones wasn't sent out to mark Gascoigne. He was sent out to terrorise him. From the first whistle, Jones ignored the ball completely. He shadowed Gaza, whispering threats, breathing down his neck. Then came the moment that turned into folklore. As a free kick was lining up, Jones didn't throw an elbow or crunch into a tackle. He reached back, grabbed Gascoigne's testicles with a vice-like grip, and didn't let go. A photographer caught the exact split-second reaction. The image is visceral. Jones's face is twisted into a snarl of pure aggression, while Gascoigne is frozen in a scream of total shock and pain. It remains one of football's most iconic photographs because it captures something raw. It wasn't a play on the ball, it was a street fight on grass. Jones later said he just wanted to introduce himself. He did more than that. He created the definitive image of English football's hard man era, proving that for Wimbledon, the mental game was just as violent as the physical one. Nizar Trabelsi. Nizar Trabelsi's story isn't just a fall from grace. It is arguably the most terrifying transformation in the history of sports. We aren't talking about a street thug who happened to be good at soccer. Trabelsi was a professional midfielder in the late 80s, suiting up for Fortuna Düsseldorf in Germany. He made it to the Bundesliga system, one of the most disciplined environments on earth. He was living the life millions of kids dream of, playing under the floodlights, earning a pro paycheck, and making it out of Tunisia to the European elite. But when the boots came off and the career fizzled out, Trabelsi didn't become a coach or open a sports bar like most retired pros. He took a nosedive into the dark underbelly of radicalisation. He traded his football kit for combat fatigues and travelled to Afghanistan. The shift is almost impossible to comprehend. The man who once took tactical instructions from a German football manager was now allegedly meeting face-to-face with Osama bin Laden. He went from the centre circle to the inner circle of Al-Qaeda. The plot was apocalyptic. Trabelsi wasn't planning a bank robbery, he was planning a massacre. He was the designated suicide bomber for a mission to drive a truck packed with explosives into the Klein Brogel airbase in Belgium. This wasn't just a military barracks, it was a facility where US nuclear weapons were stored. He was prepared to incinerate himself and countless American personnel in a ball of fire. The focus and discipline he learned as an athlete had been twisted into a singular, deadly weapon. Fortunately, the authorities blew the whistle before he could execute the play. He was arrested in Belgium just 2 days after the 9/11 attacks. He spent the next 2 decades rotting in Belgian and American prisons, while a US court eventually acquitted him in 2023. Due to complex extradition technicalities, the damage was done. He traded the beautiful game for a hateful ideology, wasting his entire life in a cell instead of on the pitch. Ched Evans. Ched Evans was a promising striker for Sheffield United and a Welsh international, a powerful forward who had found his footing in the English leagues. But his career became the centre of a national firestorm in May 2011 at a Premier Inn near Rhyl. Evans was accused of raping a 19-year-old woman, a charge that turned into a high-profile debate about consent and intoxication. In April 2012, he was convicted of rape at Caernarfon Crown Court and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 2.5 years at HMP Weymouth, maintaining his innocence the entire time. However, the legal battle did not end with his release. In a rare turn of events, the Court of Appeal quashed his conviction in 2016 based on new evidence regarding the complainant's sexual history. A retrial was ordered, and a jury eventually found him not guilty. He had served prison time for a crime he was ultimately acquitted of. The professional fallout, however, was toxic and lengthy. Sheffield United released him after the initial conviction, and attempts to sign him upon his release collapsed due to massive sponsor boycotts and public backlash. It wasn't until his acquittal that he could truly resume his career, though the shadow of the case followed him to every stadium he visited. The Hand of the Devil, Johannesburg, 2010. The game was following a perfect script. Ghana was on the verge of becoming the first African nation to reach a World Cup semi-final, playing on African soil. With the score tied 1-1 in the dying seconds of extra time, Dominic Adeyea headed the ball toward an empty net. The goal was certain. The history books were open. Then Luis Suárez chose to burn the script. He stopped the ball with a blatant, two-handed goalkeeper's parry, a cynical, calculated trade of a red card for a 1% chance of survival. What followed was a brutal twist of fate. Suárez was sent off, weeping as he walked to the tunnel. Asamoah Gyan stood over the penalty kick, the last kick of the game. If he scored, justice would be served. Instead, the ball smashed against the crossbar with a metallic clang that silenced an entire continent. The camera immediately cut to the tunnel, where Suárez, seeing the miss, exploded into jubilant celebration. He had cheated destiny and won. The penalty shootout that followed was a mere formality. Ghana was psychologically destroyed. Watching Suárez carried around the field on his teammates' shoulders afterward felt like a subversion of justice, a moment where the villain broke the rules in plain sight and was rewarded with the ultimate prize. Chelsea-Barcelona, Stamford Bridge, May 2009. This night is remembered as one of the biggest injustices in the history of European football. Chelsea were the better team, bullying Barcelona physically and creating chance after chance. But the match was defined by the man in the middle, Tom Henning Øvrebø. He seemed determined to ignore everything happening inside the penalty box. Chelsea had 4 separate, legitimate appeals for penalties, handballs, trips and clear fouls that Øvrebø waved away with a blank expression. The frustration turned into pure rage when Michael Ballack chased the referee down the pitch, screaming in his face after a clear handball by Samuel Eto'o. Then came the ultimate sucker punch. Deep in stoppage time, with their first real shot on target, Andrés Iniesta smashed the ball into the top corner. 1-1. Barcelona were going through on away goals. The final whistle triggered absolute chaos. Didier Drogba charged at the television cameras, shouting, "It's a disgrace," to the whole world. While Barcelona went on to lift the trophy, the anger was so intense that Øvrebø had to be smuggled out of England under police protection. The record books say Barcelona won, but anyone who watched knows Chelsea was simply refused the right to compete. The invisible opponent. Ray Kennedy presented a physical paradox in English football. He possessed the formidable build of a heavyweight fighter, yet his contribution to Liverpool relied on technical precision. He anchored the midfield during the club's era of continental dominance, accumulating a vast collection of domestic and European trophies. However, his physical capacity collapsed immediately following his departure from the sport. At age 35, doctors diagnosed him with Parkinson's disease. Retrospective analysis indicated the diagnosis was overdue rather than sudden. Specialists reviewed broadcast footage from the late 1970s and concluded that Kennedy had competed with the condition for years. The visual evidence documents the progression of the disease during his athletic prime. In the recordings, Kennedy runs with his right arm pinned motionless against his hip. His stride exhibits a consistent drag, and his torso maintains an unnatural rigidity. Supporters originally interpreted these mechanics as stylistic idiosyncrasies. Medical review confirms they were motor symptoms of neurological degeneration. Kennedy performed at the summit of European football while his nervous system progressively deteriorated. He executed tackles and scored goals against the resistance of his own physiology, securing the sport's highest honours while unknowingly competing with an incurable brain disease. Bruno Fernandes de Souza. In Brazil, where football is essentially a religion, Bruno Fernandes de Souza was one of its high priests. As the captain and goalkeeper for Flamengo, the most supported club in the country, he was the undisputed king of the Maracanã. He had the swagger, the athleticism, and the trophies, lifting the Brazilian league title in 2009. The path ahead was golden. The 2014 World Cup was coming to Brazil, and Bruno was widely tipped to be the starting keeper for the Seleção. He wasn't just a player, he was on the verge of becoming a national monument. But while he was keeping clean sheets on the pitch, he was orchestrating a horror movie off it. His life had become tangled by an affair with Elisa Samudio, a model who had given birth to his son. She wanted paternity recognition and child support. To Bruno, she wasn't the mother of his child. She was a liability threatening his fame and his bank account. In June 2010, he decided to make that liability disappear permanently. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden snap of anger. It was a calculated execution. Bruno's associates lured Eliza to his luxury estate in Minas Gerais under the pretense of discussing the child's future. It was a trap. According to court testimony, the nightmare unfolded brutally. She was held captive, strangled, and her body was dismembered. Then came the detail that made the collective stomach of the nation turn. Bruno admitted that parts of her remains were fed to his Rottweilers to destroy the evidence. The man, famous for his hands, had used his power to completely obliterate a human being. The country froze. The idol of Flamengo was arrested in the middle of the season. In 2013, the court found him guilty of ordering the murder, kidnapping his son, and hiding the body, which, to this day, has never been found. He was sentenced to over 22 years in prison. He traded the roar of a home World Cup for the silence of a cell, leaving a legacy defined not by his talent, but by the barbaric cruelty he forced upon a young mother. Troy Deeney. Before he became a Premier League captain and a vocal media personality, Troy Deeney was a rising talent at Watford with a troubled background and a short fuse. That fuse blew on February 29th, 2012, outside the Bliss nightclub in Birmingham. Deeney was involved in a violent brawl that spilled onto the streets, where CCTV captured him kicking a defenceless man in the head while the victim lay on the pavement. The attack left the man with a broken jaw and required 20 stitches, an act the judge later described as disgraceful. In June 2012, Deeney stood before Birmingham Crown Court and pleaded guilty to a fray. Despite pleas regarding his promising career, the judge sentenced him to 10 months in prison to send a message about public violence. He was sent to Winson Green Prison, where he faced a pivotal moment. His father died while he was incarcerated, forcing him to re-evaluate his life. Unlike many others on this list, Deeney's story became one of redemption. Watford stuck by him, suspending his wages but keeping his contract. He was released after 3 months, returned to the pitch with an ankle tag, and captained the club to the Premier League, often crediting his time in Cell Block C as the wake-up call that saved him from spiralling into total failure. The St James's Park collapse, February 2011. For the first 26 minutes, Arsenal played football from a different dimension. They were 4-0 up against Newcastle United before fans had even finished their first half-time pie. The gap in quality was so vast it felt like professionals bullying amateurs. Newcastle fans were streaming out of the exits, choosing the cold rush of the Tyne over the humiliation on the pitch. The statistical probability of a draw at that moment was effectively 0. The fracture began in the 68th minute. A red card for Abu Diaba shifted the atmosphere, but a 3-goal comeback still felt impossible. Then panic set in. Newcastle's scored once, then twice. By the 83rd minute, it was 4-3, and the Arsenal players were visibly trembling, completely paralysed by the pressure. The climax arrived in the 87th minute. A cleared ball dropped from the sky toward Sheikh Tiote. He struck a left-footed volley so pure it seemed laser-guided, screaming through a forest of legs into the bottom corner. 4-4. The stadium noise registered as physical pain. Arsenal suffered a mental collapse so severe it became the benchmark for bottling in the Premier League. Blowing a 4-goal lead in 20 minutes is unforgivable at this level. Arsenal completely fell apart. Fenerbahce, Sivasspor, May 22nd, 2011. The Sivas 4 Aylul Stadium is the only place on earth that matters. It is the final match day. Fenerbahce is neck and neck with Trabzonspor, needing a win to lock it up on goal difference. The pressure is suffocating. The game starts, and honestly, it plays out like a fever dream. Goals are flying in from everywhere. Fenerbahce takes the lead. Sivasspor punches back. It's end-to-end chaos. The crowd is manic. But as the score ticks up to 4-3 for Fenerbahce, something feels off. Like scripted off. The Sivasspor goalkeeper, Korsan Çelikay, starts making mistakes that look totally sketchy. A fumble here, a reaction time that looked like he was moving underwater there. The Fenerbahce forwards are scoring like it's a practice drill. When the final whistle blows, the players absolutely lose their minds. Champions. The fans are crying tears of joy. But while they were partying, the whole thing was about to blow up in their faces. The joy in the stadium was just a cover for a dark reality. Just weeks later, the police raids began. The trophy was lifted, sure, but that triumph got washed away fast by the cold reality of wiretaps, prison sentences, and a scandal that basically broke Turkish football. The game was a thriller, but the ending, that was written way before kickoff. Sebastian Deisler. To the German public, Sebastian Deisler was more than a talented playmaker. He was the desperate hope of a nation facing a footballing identity crisis. Dubbed Das Supertalent, he emerged in the early 2000s when the national team looked old and unimaginative. Deisler was the spark. Consequently, Bayern Munich and the fans projected all their anxieties onto him. They expected him to single-handedly resurrect German pride, a weight that would eventually crush him. While the tabloids focused entirely on his fragile knees, Deisler was fighting a much darker battle in private. The relentless pressure triggered severe depression, forcing him into psychiatric care. He famously described his existence as that of a sad clown performing tricks for the audience while feeling completely empty inside. In January 2007, he stopped the show. At 27, the age when a midfielder should be dominating Europe, Deisler walked away. He didn't retire because his leg gave out or for a sudden payout. He quit because he could no longer wage the war in his head. He told the press that the ruthless business of the Bundesliga had killed his joy. In a move that shocked the sports world, he left millions of euros and a guaranteed legacy behind, deciding that saving German football simply wasn't worth losing his mind. Luciano Cabral. Luciano Cabral was meant to be the next maestro. Born in Argentina, but representing Chile at the youth level, he was that classic number 10 archetype, all vision, flair, and the kind of silky touch that makes scouts sit up and take notice. He came through the Argentinos Juniors Academy, which is basically holy ground in football terms. It's the same nursery that produced Diego Maradona and Juan Román Riquelme. That pedigree carries serious weight. Cabral looked ready to carry it, earning caps for Chile's U20S and a prestigious move to Atlético Paranaense in Brazil. He had the technical gifts to play in Europe. His feet were magic. But while his feet were made for the pitch, his roots were tangled in the rougher reality of General Alvear, Mendoza. He never really escaped the neighbourhood. On New Year's Day, 2017, while the world was nursing hangovers and celebrating fresh starts, Cabral's career evaporated. He wasn't at a VIP party, he was back on the block, and old street tensions were boiling over. What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. Cabral, along with his father and cousins, cornered 27-year-old João Villegas. The elegance of the beautiful game was nowhere to be found. This was raw, medieval violence. Witnesses and forensic evidence painted a horror show. The group didn't just beat Villegas, they pulverised him using stones and heavy chunks of concrete found on the street. They beat a man to death in the dust while the New Year's sun was rising. The playmaker, who was used to creating goals, was now a participant in a brutal execution. The courts handed him 9.5 years for homicide. Usually, that is where the biography ends, a wasted talent rotting in a cell. But Cabral's story has a twisted third act. In 2022, he was released early for good behaviour. Incredibly, he didn't disappear. He returned to professional football in Chile, signing with Coquimbo Unido. He is one of the rare few to claw his way back to the pitch. He gets to run on the grass again and hear the crowd cheer, while João Villegas remains in the ground, a stark reminder that in football, talent often buys second chances that regular life doesn't offer. Mickey Thomas. Mickey Thomas was a journeyman winger with a glittering past, having played for Manchester United and Chelsea. By 1993, he was in the twilight of his career at Wrexham, a respected veteran. But off the pitch, he was involved in a crime that was more only fools and horses than The Godfather. Thomas was arrested for his role in a counterfeit currency ring. Authorities discovered he had been acting as an intermediary, distributing fake £10 and £20 notes to young trainees at the club. The operation was unsophisticated, but the betrayal of trust within the locker room was severe. In July 1993, the legal hammer dropped at Warrington Crown Court. The judge condemned Thomas as a flash and daring adventurer who believed he was above the law, sentencing him to 18 months in prison. He served his time at Walton Prison, where his cellmate was a convicted double murderer who had beheaded his victims. A terrifying reality check for the footballer. The professional consequences were surprisingly mild compared to modern standards. Wrexham stood by him publicly, and remarkably, he returned to play for the club immediately upon his release. However, the stigma of being the money-laundering footballer became the defining punchline of his post-playing life. A Shakespearean tragedy. The irony of this moment is almost too heavy for real life. April 2014. Liverpool was on an 11-game winning streak, destined to win their first league title in 24 years. The captain, Steven Gerrard, the local hero, the club legend, had gathered his team on the pitch weeks earlier, shouting the now infamous line, "We do not let this slip." It was the rallying cry of the season. Against a weakened Chelsea team that had nothing to play for, Liverpool just needed a draw to keep control. In first half stoppage time, tragedy struck. Mamadou Sakho played a simple pass to Gerrard near the halfway line. Simple. Routine. But Gerrard's footing gave way. He slipped. Demba Ba, lurking like a villain in the shadows, raced through on goal. No defenders, just the sprawling figure of the captain, chasing in vain. Ba scored. The silence at Anfield was heavy with the realisation of what had just happened. The man who promised not to let it slip had literally slipped to lose the title. It was a cruel twist of fate. Of all people to make that mistake, it had to be the captain who'd carried them all season. 1998 World Cup Final. The 1998 World Cup Final between France and Brazil is defined less by the football and more by the chaos that preceded the kickoff. When the official team sheets were handed out at the Stade de France, the world stopped. Brazil's star striker, Ronaldo, was missing. He was the best player on the planet, and his absence sent the media into a panic. Then, just 45 minutes before the game began, a new team sheet appeared. Ronaldo was back in. The match went ahead, but the Ronaldo on the pitch looked like a ghost. He was slow, distant, and barely touched the ball. France took full advantage of a Brazilian team that looked completely shell-shocked. Zinedine Zidane scored 2 headers in the first half to kill the contest, and Emmanuel Petit added a third in stoppage time. The 3-0 scoreline was a humiliation for the favourites. The truth only came out later. Ronaldo had suffered a convulsion in the team hotel just hours before the match. While he was medically cleared at the last minute, the emergency had rattled the entire squad. The decision to play a man immediately after a serious medical scare sparked years of anger and conspiracy theories about pressure from sponsors. To this day, we still don't know if we watched a fair football match or a corporate obligation played out on grass. The most expensive budget cut in history. Jesus Hill wasn't just a football owner, he was a walking natural disaster. The Atletico Madrid boss was known for his volatility, corruption scandals, and riding a horse to the stadium. But his greatest crime against his own club wasn't legal. It was financial stupidity. In 1992, looking to trim the budget, Gil looked at the club's youth academy. He decided it was a waste of money, so he shut it down. He effectively fired the future to save some loose change. It was a decision that would haunt Atletico for 2 decades. Because among the kids he kicked out onto the street was a 15-year-old named Raul Gonzalez. With his team dissolved, Raul simply walked across the city and signed with bitter rivals Real Madrid. He didn't just make the team. Raul became the face of Real Madrid, their captain and their all-time leading scorer at the time, tormenting Atletico in nearly every derby for the next 16 years. Gil wanted to save a few pesetas. Instead, he gifted his enemy their greatest weapon. It remains the single worst business decision in the history of Spanish football. Gavin Grant. Gavin Grant was a striker who played for Millwall and Bradford City, living the dream of professional football on Saturdays. But unbeknownst to his teammates and fans, he was deeply entrenched in the tit-for-tat gang wars of London's Stonebridge Park estate. The dark reality of his double life dated back to 2004, when Leon Labistoid was gunned down in a revenge attack. Grant was initially cleared of a separate murder charge in 2007, allowing him to continue his football career. But the cold case of Labistoid eventually caught up with him. In July 2010, the legal system finally cornered him. A jury at the Old Bailey found him guilty of murder for the 2004 shooting. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Prosecutors described him as a man who thought he had got away with murder, playing in the Football League while having blood on his hands from his role as a gangland enforcer. The professional fallout was absolute. Bradford City released him immediately, and unlike other players who hope for rehabilitation, Grant's career was terminated by a life sentence. He remains one of the only professional footballers in English history to be convicted of a gangland execution. 3 minutes in Barcelona. For 89 minutes, the 1999 Champions League final was a masterclass in German efficiency. Bayern Munich had scored early through Mario Basler and spent the rest of the match strangling the life out of Manchester United. The trophy was literally being decorated with Bayern's ribbons on the sideline. The narrative was sealed. The Germans had been the superior team, hitting the woodwork twice and controlling the tempo. But as the fourth official raised the board for 3 minutes of stoppage time, the entire world seemed to turn upside down. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a complete, instantaneous reversal of fortune. In the 91st minute, Teddy Sheringham scuffed a shot into the corner. The equaliser was shocking enough. Yet the universe wasn't finished. Less than 100 seconds later, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer stuck out a boot at a flicked-on corner, redirecting the ball into the roof of the net. The visual aftermath is what haunts the memory. Bayern defender Samuel Kufu collapsed to the turf, beating the ground with his fists in pure, unfiltered despair. The Bayern players were absolutely shattered. Kufu was pounding the ground in frustration, and the rest of them could barely pick themselves up to take the kickoff, to turn a 1-0 defeat into a 2-1 victory in the time it takes to boil a kettle stands as the most unbelievable ending in the history of club football. South Korea, Italy. The 2002 World Cup round of 16 match between Italy and South Korea is remembered for one thing: the robbery committed by Byron Moreno. The Ecuadorian referee completely hijacked the game. The decisions were baffling. First, he disallowed a perfectly legal golden goal by Damiano Tomasi for offside, even though replays showed he was clearly on. Then came the breaking point. He sent off Francesco Totti for diving, despite Totti clearly being fouled in the box. Meanwhile, the South Korean players were allowed to kick lumps out of the Italians without consequence. Elbows, studs-up tackles, and kicks to the head went unpunished. The whole thing looked like a setup. Moreno's reputation crumbled completely after the tournament. He was suspended in Ecuador for inexplicably adding 13 minutes of stoppage time to a match to help a local politician's team win. But the final nail in the coffin came years later when he was arrested at JFK Airport in New York with bags of heroin taped to his body. The fact that the referee of this match ended up a convicted drug smuggler tells you everything you need to know. It stands as perhaps the dirtiest game in World Cup history. The giant in handcuffs. In 2012, Glasgow Rangers encountered a financial collapse that effectively dismantled the corporate structure of Scotland's most decorated football institution. Following a period of administration caused by unmanageable debt, the club entered liquidation. The process transferred the assets to a new company, but the football governing bodies enforced severe regulatory consequences. Despite a history spanning 140 years and 54 league titles, the club was denied entry to the top flight. Instead, the Scottish Football League members voted to admit the reformed entity into the third division, the fourth and lowest tier of the national pyramid. The demotion was accompanied by a restrictive 12-month transfer embargo. The sanctions prohibited the club from registering any new professional players over the age of 18, severely limiting the ability to reconstruct the squad. Rangers, accustomed to European nights and Old Firm derbies, found themselves competing against semi-professional opposition in regional venues. The disparity was stark. The club hosted matches at Ibrox Stadium with crowds exceeding 40,000 while visiting grounds with capacities in the hundreds. The recovery process required 4 seasons of competition to navigate the divisional hierarchy. Rangers finally secured promotion back to the Scottish Premiership in 2016. The 4-year exile remains a singular event in modern football, illustrating the absolute fragility of even the most established sporting organisations when faced with fiscal insolvency. Fabrizio Micheli. Fabrizio Micheli was the Romario of the Salento, the legendary captain of Palermo, and a former Italy international, beloved for his goals and passion. But his legacy in Sicily was destroyed by a shocking association with the Cosa Nostra. The investigation, which began in 2010, revealed that Micheli had asked the son of a notorious mafia boss to help recover a debt. In wiretapped conversations, Micheli was heard calling the murdered anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone filth, a comment that is considered the ultimate sin in Italian society. The legal saga dragged on for a decade, but in November 2021, Italy's Supreme Court upheld his conviction for extortion aggravated by mafia methods. Micheli turned himself in at Rovigo prison to serve a 3.5-year sentence. The court ruled that while he didn't use violence himself, soliciting help from the mafia legitimised their power. The professional consequences were retroactive, but devastating. He was forced to step down from a coaching role immediately. While he remains Palermo's all-time top scorer, his name is now forever complicated by his insult to a national hero and his links to the criminal organisation that plagued the city he once led. 20 seconds of madness. In the high-stakes theatre of English football, the Championship playoff semi-final is notoriously cruel, but the conclusion of the 2013 match at Vicarage Road stands out as perhaps the sport's most surreal sequence. With the aggregate score tied in the 97th minute, Leicester City was awarded a controversial penalty. The narrative seemed set. Anthony Knockaert would score, send Leicester to Wembley, and end Watford's season. The stadium held its breath, resigning itself to a heartbreaking defeat. Then, in a span of 20 seconds, the entire atmosphere of the stadium flipped completely. That final minute was absolute chaos. Manuel Almunia didn't just save the penalty, he saved the rebound, a double intervention that kept Watford on life support. But the true chaos started in the transition. Instead of clearing the ball, Watford launched a desperate, lung-busting counter-attack. The ball travelled from Cassetti to Anya, then a looped cross to the back post, where Jonathan Hogg knocked it down. Troy Deeney, arriving like a freight train, smashed the volley into the net. In a blur of frantic action, the game shifted from a potential Leicester winner to a Watford goal. In 20 seconds, Leicester went from guaranteed finalists to eliminated, while Watford fans spilled onto the pitch in a massive wave of disbelief. To watch the replay is to witness sport at its most cruel and euphoric. One moment, Leicester had a penalty to win it, and 20 seconds later, Deeney is smashing a volley into the net at the other end to send the home crowd into a frenzy. The impossible 2002 quarter-final. Statistical anomalies are an accepted part of football, but the 2002 World Cup quarter-final between Spain and South Korea defies standard probability. While the official records show South Korea advancing on penalties, a forensic review of the regular time and extra time exposes a sequence of decisions that feel mathematically impossible. We are not discussing subjective foul calls or 50-50 challenges here. We are analysing two perfectly legitimate goals being wiped off the board in a single knockout match. The first incident saw a chaotic set piece end with the ball in the net, only for the referee to blow for a push that replay technology confirms never occurred. However, the true smoking gun arrived later in the match. Joaquin executed a perfect run and crossed the ball for Morientes to head home what should have been a golden goal winner. The linesman immediately raised his flag, claiming the ball had crossed the byline. High-definition freeze frames have since proven the ball was still inches inside the field of play. To have one goal wrongly disallowed is a rare misfortune. To have two annulled against the host nation suggests the outcome was predetermined. It forces us to ask whether the linesman was simply incompetent or if he was actively protecting the tournament's lucrative narrative. The homeless giant slayer, Alireza Bayramvand, secured his position in elite football through a path defined by extreme poverty. As a teenager, he left his family home in rural Iran after his father forbade him from pursuing a career in the sport. Bayramvand arrived in Tehran with no capital and spent his initial weeks sleeping on the concrete pavement outside the gates of a local football club. To survive while attending tryouts, he relied on a series of manual labour jobs. He worked in a dressmaking factory and a pizza shop, but his height determined his primary employment. Bayramvand took a position at a car wash, where his large frame made him the specialist for scrubbing the roofs of SUVs. This period of homelessness and labour preceded his selection for the 2018 World Cup in Russia. In a critical group stage match against Portugal, the referee awarded a penalty kick to Cristiano Ronaldo. The moment placed Bayramvand directly against the reigning World Player of the Year. The goalkeeper correctly read the striker's intent, diving low to his left to catch the ball and deny the conversion. The save preserved a draw for the Iranian national team. The intervention on the global stage underscored the magnitude of his ascent, marking the transition from sleeping on the streets of Tehran to stopping a penalty from the sport's most dominant forward. Gary Medine. Gary Medine was a striker for Sheffield Wednesday, with a reputation for finding the net, earning him the nickname Goal Machine. However, he had an equally well-earned reputation for violence. In early 2012, his aggression spiralled out of control in two separate incidents. First, he broke a fellow fan's nose in a bar. 4 weeks later, he shattered a man's cheekbone with a single punch in a nightclub. At the time of the attacks, Medine was already known for his short fuse and had a previous conviction for knocking a man out in Carlisle. In October 2013, a jury at Leeds Crown Court found him guilty of assault, occasioning actual bodily harm and grievous bodily harm. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in prison, noting that when drunk, Medine displayed a callous disregard for others. He served 5 months before being released. Unlike many clubs that cut ties with convicted players, Sheffield Wednesday controversially chose not to fire him. He returned to the team upon his release, publicly apologising, and went on to have a successful career with Bolton and Cardiff City. However, the Goal Machine moniker was often rivaled by the tag Thug in the tabloids for years after his release. The Camp Nou miracle. The premise of the second leg was mathematically absurd. Paris Saint-Germain had demolished Barcelona 4-0 in France, a lead that, historically, was insurmountable. No team in Champions League history had ever overturned a 4-goal deficit. As the clock ticked past the 87th minute, Barcelona still required 3 goals to advance. The atmosphere in the Camp Nou was one of sombre acceptance. The players looked exhausted, and the fans were preparing for an honourable exit. Then, the match shifted in a way that felt almost impossible to explain. The spark came from a Neymar free kick in the 88th minute, a moment of individual brilliance that initially seemed like a consolation. But panic is a contagious force. When Luis Suárez won a penalty moments later, the PSG players visibly froze, paralysed by the sudden shift in momentum. Neymar scored again, 5-1. They still needed one more. In the dying seconds of stoppage time, with goalkeeper Marc-Andre ter Stegen playing as a midfielder, a desperate chip found Sergi Roberto. His toe-poke finish triggered a roar so loud it literally registered on a local seismometer as a micro-earthquake. 3 goals in 7 minutes. It was a sequence where logic, tactics, and time management simply stopped mattering. When the final whistle blew, the PSG players just dropped. They looked shell-shocked, like they couldn't process what had just happened. It proved that at the Camp Nou, the word impossible doesn't really apply. Mexico-Panama. The 2015 Gold Cup semi-final between Mexico and Panama is widely regarded as one of the most disgraceful matches in CONCACAF history. It wasn't just bad refereeing, it looked like a calculated move to ensure the tournament's biggest commercial draw reached the final. Panama, playing with 10 men after an incredibly harsh early red card, defended heroically and led 1-0 deep into stoppage time in Atlanta. They were seconds away from a historic upset. Then, American referee Mark Geiger made a call that nearly caused a riot. In the 89th minute, Panama defender Roman Torres fell backward onto the ball while losing his balance. He wasn't even looking at the play, yet Geiger immediately pointed to the penalty spot for a handball. The decision was shocking. The Panamanian players threatened to walk off the field, delaying the game for over 10 minutes in a scene of absolute chaos. Andres Guardado eventually scored the penalty to force extra time, where Mexico won with a second dubious call. The aftermath was damning. Panama players posed in the locker room with a banner calling the organisers corrupt thieves, and the federation president publicly accused the match of being fixed to protect ticket sales. Geiger later admitted to officiating errors, but the apology rang hollow for a team robbed of their glory. Jamie Lawrence. Jamie Lawrence is a rare story of a player who went to prison before becoming a Premier League star. In the early 90s, Lawrence was a teenager in South London involved in serious gang activity. His crimes weren't minor indiscretions. He was arrested for a bank robbery. In 1990, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served his time at Camp Hill on the Isle of Wight, where he played for the prison team. It was inside those walls that he decided to turn his life around, using the discipline of sport to survive the sentence. Upon his release in 1993, his rise was meteoric. He was spotted playing non-league football and was quickly signed by Sunderland. Remarkably, just a few years after sitting in a prison cell, he was playing in the Premier League for Bradford City and earning international caps for Jamaica's Reggae Boys. His professional fallout was actually a professional beginning. Lawrence remains one of the few players to openly discuss how prison saved him from an early grave, transforming him from a bank robber into a Premier League cult hero. Marcos Alonso. In Spanish football, Marcos Alonso isn't just a name on a shirt, it's a dynasty. His grandfather, Marquitos, won 5 European Cups with Real Madrid. His father played for Atletico and Barcelona. Marcos was the third generation, the 188cm heir apparent with a left foot that could paint masterpieces. He went on to win the Premier League with Chelsea and wear the famous stripes of Barcelona, seemingly fulfilling the destiny set out by his bloodline. But in 2011, long before the major trophies, Alonso was just a 20-year-old kid at Bolton Wanderers, making terrible decisions back home in Madrid. On a wet morning in May, after a night out, he got behind the wheel of a BMW. He wasn't just driving, he was flying. On a street limited to 50 kilometers per hour, Alonso was clocking 112 kilometers per hour, more than double the legal limit, careening through the rain with 3 passengers trusting him with their lives. Physics eventually took over. The car lost grip and smashed into a stone wall, snapping the fantasy of invincibility in an instant. Alonso and 2 passengers survived, but the 4th didn't make it. A 19-year-old woman, a friend of the group, suffered severe brain trauma and died shortly after. The police report was damning. Alonso's blood alcohol level was 0.93 grams, nearly double the limit in Spain. He was speeding, he was over the limit, and a young woman was dead because of it. The legal system stared him down, threatening 4 years in prison for reckless homicide. But unlike others who face similar charges, Alonso never saw the inside of a cell. His lawyers reached an out-of-court financial settlement with the victim's family, reportedly around €500,000. By 2016, the request for prison time was dropped, swapped for a driving ban and a €61,000 fine. He kept his freedom and his career, going on to lift the Champions League. But for many fans, his legacy isn't the trophies. It's the fact that he walked away from a wall that someone else didn't. Roberto Carlos's banana kick. Leon, 1997. The match was a meaningless exhibition, a warm-up for the World Cup. But in the 21st minute, Roberto Carlos stepped up to a free kick 35 yards from goal and seemingly broke the laws of aerodynamics. The setup was absurd. He placed the ball, took a run-up that started in a different postcode, and struck it with the outside of his left boot. To the naked eye, the shot was a failure. It was heading yards wide of the post, destined for the corner flag. Then, the ball took a path that didn't seem possible. In midair, the ball encountered a pocket of turbulence that didn't make sense. It slowed down and violently swerved inward, correcting its path by nearly 15 degrees in a split second. Fabien Barthez, the French goalkeeper, didn't even dive. He stood frozen, watching the ball clip the post and nestle into the net, assuming it had gone wide until the crowd roared. Physics professors later wrote papers on the Magnus effect to explain the trajectory, but watching the replay looks less like a physics demonstration and more like a magic trick. It's the greatest free kick of all time. The swerve on the ball was ridiculous. It was heading for the corner flag before it curled in. Bayern Munich fans are still haunted by the 2017 Champions League quarter-final. To them, the events at the Bernabeu went far beyond a simple sporting defeat. The match serves as the ultimate example of a televised robbery, single-handedly orchestrated by referee Victor Kassai. From the opening whistle, the atmosphere felt tilted, but the second half is where the integrity of the competition completely dissolved. Bayern fought like warriors to force extra time, silencing the Madrid crowd. Then, the officiating collapsed. Arturo Vidal goes in for a tackle. He wins the ball cleanly, with undeniable precision. What does Kassai do? He flashes a second yellow and ejects him. It was baffling. Meanwhile, Real's Casemiro is out there, treating the midfield like a wrestling ring, committing foul after brutal foul, yet somehow remaining immune to a second booking. The double standard was so blatant it felt personal. Then came extra time, which played out like a dark comedy. Cristiano Ronaldo scores to shift the momentum, but replays showed he was miles offside, literally standing alone, waiting for the pass. The linesman didn't flinch, keeping his flag down while the world watched in disbelief. Minutes later, Marcelo breaks through and squares it to Ronaldo for another tap-in. Offside again? Without a doubt. Real Madrid took the 4-2 win on the back of 2 illegal goals and a phantom red card. This heist was so obvious that it practically forced UEFA to fast-track VAR just to save the sport from itself. The assault on the touchline. August 23rd, 2006. Manchester City versus Portsmouth. The ball was bouncing toward the sideline. A harmless moment in a standard game. Then Ben Thatcher turned it into a crime scene. As Pedro Mendes ran to clear the ball, Thatcher didn't decelerate. He locked on. He delivered a sprinting, calculated elbow directly into Mendes' jaw. The impact was horrific. Mendes was unconscious before his body even hit the grass, sliding helplessly, violently into the advertising boards. The scene on the sideline turned into a medical emergency immediately. Mendes suffered a seizure while medics frantically administered oxygen, rushing him to the hospital with severe head trauma. But the true insanity happened on the pitch. The referee reached into his pocket and showed Thatcher a yellow card, a caution, for an act that looked more like a cage fight than football. The crowd was stunned. Mendes was fighting for consciousness in an ambulance while his attacker was still jogging around the midfield. The backlash was nuclear. Manchester City suspended their own player before the FA could even open the file. To this day, the footage is hard to watch a split second, where the sport completely vanished, replaced by an act of pure violence. Ian Wright. Before he became an Arsenal legend and a beloved television pundit, Ian Wright was an aimless amateur footballer struggling to find his path. In 1982, years before he would lift the Premier League trophy, a 19-year-old Wright was living a chaotic life in South London. He had accumulated a mountain of unpaid driving fines and was driving without insurance. When he couldn't pay the mounting costs, the law caught up with him. He was arrested and sentenced to 14 days in Chelmsford Prison, a stark reality check for a young man who had been rejected by professional clubs multiple times. The experience inside was brief but transformative. Wright described the moment the cell door locked as the most frightening of his life, surrounded by hardened criminals who mocked his tears. He vowed never to return. Upon his release, he channeled that fear into a relentless work ethic. The prison stint became the catalyst for his entire career. Within 3 years, he was signed by Crystal Palace, and he went on to become Arsenal's record goal scorer. Unlike others on this list, Wright's story is the ultimate example of prison serving its purpose as a sharp, corrective turning point rather than a career ender. Luke McCormick. Luke McCormick was the definition of safe hands. At Plymouth Argyle, he wasn't just the goalkeeper, he was the captain, the anchor, and the guy the fans trusted to hold the line. In the Championship, he was building a genuine reputation as a reliable shot stopper, racking up over 150 appearances. Goalkeepers are wired to be the responsible ones, the last line of defence who see the danger developing before anyone else does. They are the protectors. But on June 7th, 2008, McCormick's judgment failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He had been at a former teammate's wedding in Bolton. The party went late, the drinks flowed, and sleep was non-existent. At dawn, instead of passing out on a hotel sofa or calling a cab, McCormick made the fatal decision to get behind the wheel of his black Range Rover. He was exhausted, and his blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. As he hit the M6 motorway, he wasn't a professional athlete anymore. He was a guided missile in a 2-ton metal box. Around 5:44 a.m., physics took over. McCormick fell asleep at the wheel. His SUV drifted across the lanes and slammed violently into a Toyota Previa, carrying a family on their way to a dream day out at Silverstone. The impact was horrific. The crash killed 10-year-old Aaron Peake and his 4-year-old brother, Ben. Their father, Phil, was left with a shattered spine and a destroyed life. 2 young boys were extinguished instantly because a man paid to protect a net couldn't protect the public from his own ego. The judge sentenced him to 7 years and 4 months for causing death by dangerous driving. He served roughly 4 years before walking free in 2012. Then came the controversy that split fans down the middle. McCormick actually returned to professional football. He eventually re-signed for Plymouth, even reclaiming the captain's armband. He got his career back. He got his life back. He heard the cheers of the crowd again. But Aaron and Ben Peake remained frozen in time, victims of a goalkeeper who made the ultimate error. McCormick might have made thousands of saves since that day, but the stain of that morning on the M6 is something no amount of clean sheets can ever wash away. Beckham versus Greece. Old Trafford, 2001. The narrative for England was bleak, trailing 2-1 to Greece in stoppage time. They were facing the humiliation of missing automatic World Cup qualification. The team played with fear, their legs heavy, their minds broken. But David Beckham, a man vilified by his own nation just 3 years prior, decided to play a different sport entirely. For 93 minutes, he had run nearly 16 kilometres, demanding the ball, taking every corner, every throw-in, seemingly fighting 11 Greek players alone. The defining moment arrived in the 93rd minute. England won a free kick. It was the last kick of the game. The stadium fell into a hush that felt almost religious. Beckham stepped up. He struck the ball with a perfection that seemed almost artistic. The ball curled with a ferocity and precision that felt preordained, whipping over the wall and into the top corner. The explosion of noise at Old Trafford was a chaotic mix of celebration, relief, and disbelief. Beckham sprinted to the corner flag, arms outstretched, completing a redemption arc so perfect It felt like cheap Hollywood writing. He was a man possessed that day. He dragged that team over the line single-handedly. West Germany versus Austria. Gijón, Spain, 1982. This match is the reason the rules of the World Cup had to be rewritten. The situation was simple. Algeria had already played their final game. If West Germany beat Austria 1-0, and both European neighbours would qualify for the next round, sending the exciting Algerian team home. It was a scenario ripe for corruption, but fans expected professional integrity. They didn't get it. Horst Hrubesch scored for Germany after 10 minutes, making it 1-0. Then the match effectively died. For the next 80 minutes, the teams entered a shameful, unspoken truce. They passed the ball sideways, walking around the pitch with zero intention of attacking. The atmosphere in the stadium turned toxic. Spanish locals waved white handkerchiefs in disgust, while Algerian fans in the stands burned money and screamed, "Fix!" The outrage was immediate and universal. The German commentator refused to speak for long stretches, unable to justify what he was seeing, and the Austrian broadcaster bluntly told viewers to turn off their TVs. Both teams got their ticket to the next round, but they lost their dignity in the process. This public betrayal forced FIFA to change the format forever, ensuring final group games are now played simultaneously so that this kind of collusion never happens again. The man who played in armour, Ivan Klasnic, returned to elite football following a medical crisis that typically ends careers. In 2007, while playing at his peak for Werder Bremen, his body quietly turned on him. It wasn't a typical sports injury like a torn ACL. It was total kidney failure. His organs were shutting down in plain sight. The first attempt to fix it was a nightmare. His mother donated a kidney, but Klasnic's body rejected it almost immediately. That is usually where the career ends. The physical toll of rejection combined with the heavy immune-suppressing drugs should have forced him into retirement, but Klasnic refused to fold. He went back under the knife for a second transplant, this time receiving a kidney from his father. What happened next defies medical logic. Less than a year later, he wasn't just living. He was starting for Croatia at Euro 2008. He played with a custom-made fiberglass belt strapped under his jersey, a literal shield to protect the donor organ. One bad tackle in the wrong spot could have been catastrophic. Yet, he didn't just survive the contact. He scored 2 goals in the tournament. He became the first player in history to compete at a major international finals with a transplanted kidney, proving he could beat the best defenders in Europe and his own anatomy at the same time. Stig Tufting. Stig Tufting was the pitbull of the Danish midfield, a fearsome competitor who played for Bolton Wanderers and Hamburg. Known for his hard tackles and tattoos, he had a tragic backstory. He found his parents dead in a murder-suicide when he was 13. That darkness seemed to follow him. In June 2002, just hours after returning to Copenhagen, following Denmark's World Cup elimination, Tufting went to a cafe for a farewell party with teammates. When the cafe owner complained about the noise, the situation exploded. Tufting headbutted the owner and assaulted the head chef, leaving the owner with a facial cut that required stitches. In October 2002, a Copenhagen court sentenced him to 4 months in prison for assault. It was not his first conviction. He had a suspended sentence from a previous altercation in 1999. Bolton Wanderers eventually released him, and his international career ended in disgrace. He served his time at a minimum security facility where he worked as a gardener. While he returned to play in the Danish league and later became a pundit, the cafe ketchup incident cemented his reputation as a player who couldn't leave the violence on the pitch. Lee Hughes. Lee Hughes wasn't just a striker. He was a god at the Hawthorns. With his ginger hair and that trademark Irish jig celebration, he was the heartbeat of West Bromwich Albion. He was the ultimate local lad, done good a former roofer, who climbed from non-league obscurity to the Premier League. He represented the dream, hard work pays off, and suddenly you're earning big money and driving the flashiest cars. He was the king of the Black Country, beloved because he felt like one of the fans who just happened to be good at football. But the line between confidence and arrogance is razor thin, and in November 2003, Hughes crossed it with fatal consequences. He was behind the wheel of his £100,000 Mercedes CL 500 near Meriden. He wasn't just commuting. Witnesses described him driving like a man who thought the rules of the road didn't apply to Premier League stars. The crash was violent. Hughes lost control and ploughed his high-performance Mercedes into a Renault Scenic. The impact killed 56-year-old Douglas Graham, a father of 4, instantly. His wife and the driver were left trapped in the wreckage, fighting for their lives. But it wasn't the accident itself that turned the public against him. It was the cowardly act that followed. He didn't try to help the dying man. He didn't call emergency services. Instead, he fled. Hughes ran from the scene on foot, disappearing into the night to save himself. Prosecutors argued it was a calculated move to avoid a breathalyzer test. He hid for 36 hours, finally turning himself in only after any alcohol would have likely left his system. In 2004, the law caught up with him. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison for causing death by dangerous driving. He served 3 years before being released. The real controversy started when he returned to professional football, scoring goals for Oldham and Notts County. He got his career back and he got to hear the roar of the crowd again. But the Irish jig was never the same. He proved he could still score goals, but he could never outrun the reality that he left a father to die on the side of the road just to save his own skin. The Viking anomaly. Nice. 2016. On paper, this was an accounting error. England, the inventors of the sport, possessed a population of 55 million and the richest league on earth. Iceland was a nation of 330,000 people, literally the size of Leicester, coached by a part-time dentist. When Wayne Rooney scored a penalty in the 4th minute, reality seemed secure, but the expected order of things collapsed almost immediately. Within 60 seconds, Iceland equalised via a long throw-in tactic from the 1980s that elite teams should effortlessly defend. 12 minutes later, Kolbeinn Sigthorsson's weak shot trickled through Joe Hart's wrists, 2-1. For the next 70 minutes, the most shocking aspect was the complete mental collapse of the English players. They stopped functioning. Passes went straight into touch. Professional athletes forgot how to trap a ball. They looked like terrified amateurs who had won a competition to play in the Euros. The final whistle triggered a scene that defied logic. The England manager resigned immediately and players collapsed in shame, while the Icelandic team led their fans in the Viking clap, a rhythmic, thunderous chant that sounded like a war drum. It was the biggest humiliation in England's history. They were beaten by a country the size of Leicester. There is a special circle of sporting hell reserved for moments like Bloemfontein in 2010. Fans can usually accept their team playing poorly or a striker missing a sitter. What they cannot accept is physics being ignored by the officials. England was clawing their way back into the World Cup knockout clash against Germany when Frank Lampard produced a moment of magic. His chip beat the keeper, hit the crossbar, and bounced down. It didn't just graze the line. It was a yard deep into the goal. The entire stadium saw it bounce in. Millions watching on TV saw it. The only 2 people on the planet who didn't see it were the referee and his assistant. The German goalkeeper, Manuel Neuer, grabbed the ball with the guilty speed of a thief in the night and played on immediately. The momentum was shattered instantly. Instead of being level at 2-2 with all the energy, England was forced to chase a game they had essentially already equalised. The emotional toll of that injustice broke the team's spirit, while this disaster forced FIFA to finally bring in goal line technology that is zero comfort to the fans who travelled thousands of miles only to be sent home by a blind call. It remains one of the greatest robberies in history. The street to the stratosphere. Pepe's path to the Premier League didn't start on a pristine academy pitch. It started in a church-run shelter outside Lisbon. Abandoned by his parents as a child, Tiago Manuel Dias Correa, better known as Pepe, spent his youth not worrying about contracts, but about survival. He lived in a homeless shelter for 8 years. His training ground was the concrete. He was so far off the grid that he was initially selected for the Homeless World Cup team, not a national youth squad. Then the universe glitched. In the span of just 5 weeks, he went from playing in the Portuguese 3rd Division to the front page of every paper in England. Sir Alex Ferguson, the most meticulous manager in history, signed him for roughly £7 million. Here is the crazy part. Ferguson later admitted he had never even seen him play. He went from living in a shelter to wearing the Manchester United badge in barely a month. It remains one of the most baffling transfers in football history. A street footballer plucked a golden ticket out of thin air, proving that sometimes talent doesn't need an address to be found. Coque, Sergio Contreras, known as Coque, was a journeyman striker who had a respectable career playing for Malaga in La Liga and Marseille in France, and even winning a league title in Greece with Aris. But after retiring, his ambition grew dangerous. In November 2019, a massive police operation called Vinculum targeted a drug trafficking organisation in southern Spain. Police arrested 20 people and seized a ton of hashish, weapons and cash. To the shock of the public, the identified ringleader was Coque. Prosecutors described him as the boss who gave the orders, managing a complex network that moved drugs across Europe. He spent a year and 8 months in prison on remand before being released on bail. In May 2023, facing a potential 16-year sentence, he confessed to leading the criminal organisation and accepted a plea deal of 6 years in prison. The striker, who once hunted for goals, had become a narco, hunting for illicit profits, ending his story as the head of a major criminal enterprise. Jose Antonio Reyes was pure electricity. On the pitch, he was the kind of winger who got fans out of their seats a drop of the shoulder, a burst of acceleration, and he was gone. A prodigy at Sevilla, he became a legend in London as the first Spaniard to win the Premier League, immortalised as a member of Arsenal's Invincibles. He collected trophies at Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, and Benfica like they were souvenirs. He had a left foot capable of magic, and a smile that lit up every locker room he walked into. For nearly 2 decades, he lived life in the fast lane of elite sports. But the fast lane wasn't just a metaphor for Reyes, it was a lifestyle that eventually proved fatal. By 2019, at age 35, his career was winding down, but his passion for high-performance machinery hadn't faded. On the morning of June 1st, 2019, he was behind the wheel of a Mercedes 550, a modified beast of a car built for extreme power. He was travelling on the A376 motorway from Seville to his hometown of Utrera, and he wasn't just speeding, he was flying. The police report was grim. Reyes was clocking 237 kilometres per hour, more than 100 kilometres per hour over the legal limit. At those speeds, the laws of physics are unforgiving. A rear tyre blew out, likely unable to handle the immense pressure. The car didn't just crash, it disintegrated. It veered off the road, flipped, and erupted into a fireball, leaving a stretch of scorched earth in its wake. Reyes died instantly. But the tragedy is that he didn't die alone. The crash also claimed the life of his 23-year-old cousin, Jonathan Reyes, who was sitting in the back seat. Another cousin managed to escape the burning wreckage with severe injuries. The investigation was clear. Excessive speed was the sole cause. It was legally classified as a reckless homicide, even though the driver perished with the victim. Reyes will always be remembered as an invincible on the pitch, but on that stretch of highway in Seville, his reckless decision proved that no one is invincible against the road. The Lucas Moura Miracle. Amsterdam, 2019. The narrative was already written in ink. Ajax, a team of young, homegrown prodigies, had shammed Europe. They were leading Tottenham 2-0 at halftime, 3-0 on aggregate. The countdown to the final had begun. The fans were celebrating with the joy of a team that knew destiny was on their side. Tottenham looked broken, disjointed, and devoid of ideas. Then, the entire narrative fell apart. Lucas Moura, a player known for inconsistency, suddenly became the most lethal finisher on the planet. He scored in the 55th minute, then again in the 59th. The impossible dread began to creep into the Johan Cruyff Arena. But as the clock hit the 96th minute, the final second of stoppage time, Ajax still held the advantage. Then came the long ball, the flick, the slip. Moura slashed a left-footed shot into the corner. The stadium went dead silent. The Ajax fans were absolutely gutted. The Ajax players dropped to the turf simultaneously, completely spent. They lay face down on the grass, sobbing, while Tottenham players sprinted around like lunatics. It was the cruelest finish in the history of the sport, a knife twist in the very last second that turned a fairy tale season into a horror story. Netherlands, Argentina. If you missed the Battle of Lucelle, you missed the most chaotic football match of the century. This was absolute madness from start to finish. Mateu Lahoz walked onto the pitch and basically decided he was the main character. He was tossing out yellow cards like confetti. You get a card. You get a card. The bench gets a card. It was a total circus. The players were genuinely losing their minds. At one point, Paredes wipes out Arke, then smashes the ball straight into the Dutch dugout. The whole bench empties. People are shoving, screaming, and Lahoz is just standing there, blowing his whistle like that's going to help. Then, just when you think Argentina has it locked up, Lahoz adds 10 minutes of stoppage time. 10. The Dutch score a miracle equaliser, and we go to penalties. The drama was off the charts. Argentina wins, but forget sportsmanship. Nobody is shaking hands here. Dumfries is getting sent off after the game ends. Messi is straight up beefing with Van Gaal on live TV. It was pure energy. The referee completely lost the plot, turning a tactical battle into a bar fight. It was ugly, it was messy, and honestly, it was incredibly entertaining, as long as you weren't one of the players trying to survive it. The ghost who won the World Cup. In 1980, Italian football authorities implicated Paolo Rossi in the Totonero match-fixing scandal. The federation handed the striker a 3-year ban, later reduced to 2 years, effectively removing him from professional competition during his athletic prime. Throughout the suspension, Rossi maintained his innocence, but the sanction isolated him from the sport. His exclusion seemed absolute until his eligibility was restored just weeks prior to the 1982 World Cup. National team manager Enzo Bearzot selected Rossi for the squad, despite his lack of recent match practice. The decision provoked intense scepticism from the Italian media, who argued the striker was unfit for the intensity of international play. Rossi initially struggled, failing to score in the early group matches. This trajectory changed in the second round against Brazil. Rossi scored a hat-trick to eliminate the tournament favourites, followed by 2 goals in the semi-final and the opening strike in the final against West Germany. He finished the tournament with the Golden Boot, the Golden Ball, and the World Cup trophy. The performance completed a total rehabilitation of his image, shifting his status from a suspended outcast to the decisive figure in Italy's victory. Marcelo Plech was a tough-tackling Brazilian defender who spent 6 years in the German Bundesliga with Borussia Mönchengladbach and Kaiserslautern. He was known for his aggression and leadership on the pitch, a solid professional who made over 140 appearances in Germany's top flight. After retiring in 2011, he returned to his native Brazil to become a pig farmer. But in November 2015, military police in Paraná stopped a white Iveco truck registered to Plech. Inside, they found 854 bricks of marijuana, weighing a massive 793 kilograms. The sheer scale of the haul left no room for leniency. Plech was arrested and charged with drug trafficking. In 2016, a Brazilian court sentenced the former Bundesliga star to 9 years and 2 months in a state prison. The news shocked his former teammates in Germany, who remembered him as a joker in the locker room, not a drug lord. He served part of his sentence before transitioning to an open prison regime, but his legacy in football was completely overshadowed by his second career as a logistics man for the Brazilian drug trade. Courtney Meppenwalter. Courtney Meppenwalter was supposed to be the future of Manchester City's defence. A tall, commanding centre-back, he wasn't just a prospect, he was a leader. He captained England at the U18 level and was pocketing a reported £1,000 a week before he'd even made a first-team appearance. He spent his mornings training alongside Premier League titans like Vincent Kompany and Yaya Touré, absorbing the game at the highest level. He had the build, the pedigree, and the bank balance of a star in the making. He was living the teenage dream in a city that worships football. But with fast money comes fast cars. And for Meppenwalter, that combination proved lethal. It was September 2012, and the 18-year-old was behind the wheel of his Mercedes C220 CDI. He wasn't just driving home, he was playing games with a friend in a Volkswagen Golf. They were accelerating, braking, and weaving in a high-speed convoy, a stupid, dangerous race on public roads, fueled by youthful arrogance and adrenaline. The game ended in absolute carnage at a junction on Berry New Road. The speed limit was 48 kilometres per hour. Meppen Walter was doing nearly double that, roughly 90 kilometres per hour, when he slammed his Mercedes into the side of a Nissan Micra. The impact was catastrophic. The driver, 32-year-old Kulwant Singh, and his sister, 37-year-old Ravel Kaur, were killed instantly. They weren't just random victims, they were the pillars of their families. In a split second, Meppen Walter didn't just wreck 2 cars, he created orphans. The fallout was swift but controversial. In 2013, he pleaded guilty to causing death by careless driving. The judge handed down a 16-month prison sentence, a punishment many felt was a slap on the wrist, given the loss of 2 lives. He served his time and was released, eventually returning to football in the lower leagues with clubs like Carlisle United. He got a second chance at a career. The family in the Nissan Micra never got a second chance at life. He traded a Premier League future for a permanent record, forever known as the prospect who threw it all away for a cheap thrill on a Manchester street. A glitch in physics. Bergkamp pulled off a move most players wouldn't even attempt in training. He flicked the ball one way, spun the other, and left De Bezos tackling thin air before coolly finishing. The context was a standard Premier League match. Robert Pires drilled a hard low pass to Bergkamp, who was standing at the edge of the box with his back to the goal, marked tightly by Nikos De Bezos. What happened next occurred too fast for the defender or the cameras to fully process in real time. Bergkamp didn't control the ball. He flicked it with his left foot around one side of the defender, while simultaneously pirouetting 180 degrees around the other side to meet it. It was a move that shouldn't work. The ball had backspin. The defender was physically obstructing him. Yet Bergkamp spun around the other side to meet the ball, leaving the defender swiping at thin air. De Bezos fell to the ground, his legs tangled, looking like a drunk man trying to catch a ghost. Bergkamp coolly slotted the finish into the far corner. Replays were played dozens of times, and pundits still struggled to explain the mechanics of the touch. It required a level of spatial awareness that bordered on impossible. To this day, fans debate if he meant it. He says he did. The footage shows a touch so perfect, it almost looks accidental. It stands as one of the most technically incredible goals ever scored, a moment where a human being manipulated the ball in a way that seemed physically impossible. 2022 World Cup. In the business of global entertainment, nothing is more valuable than a perfect story arc. In 2022, FIFA didn't just sell a tournament, they seemingly sold a coronation. The conspiracy theory here isn't necessarily about a specific referee being bribed, but rather the Disneyfication of the sport. The powers that be needed a definitive greatest of all time to market for the next 50 years. And the tournament provided exactly that. Consider the statistical anomalies. Argentina was awarded 5 penalties in 7 games, a World Cup record. While many of these were technically fouls, they were of the soft variety that referees often ignore for other nations. Why the discrepancy? Because the image of Lionel Messi lifting the trophy in Qatar, wearing a Qatari robe, no less was the ultimate branding exercise for the hosts and the sports advertisers. Consider the alternative. France winning again. That's a sequel nobody buys. But the Messi final? That is a cinematic masterpiece that generates billions in engagement. When you observe how the bracket opened up and how the whistle blew in crucial moments, you have to wonder, was this sport, or was it a carefully curated reality show designed to give the customers the ending they desperately wanted? Graham Poll, the referee who forgot how to count. In the history of the World Cup, there is one rule that is absolute. 2 yellow cards equal a red. It's basic math. But in 2006, England's top referee, Graham Poll, decided to rewrite the rulebook. During a chaotic match between Croatia and Australia, Poll was losing control. In the 61st minute, he booked Croatian defender Josip Šimunić. Standard procedure. In the 91st minute, Šimunić committed another foul. Poll reached into his pocket, pulled out the yellow card again, and nothing happened. He wrote it down, but his brain glitched. He didn't show the red. He let a player with 2 bookings stay on the pitch. The game continued in a surreal state of error until the 93rd minute. Šimunić, perhaps confused why he was still playing, argued with Poll again. For the 3rd time, Poll showed him a yellow. Finally, the the red came out. It was the only time in World Cup history a player has been sent off for 3 yellow cards. Paul wasn't corrupt. He just had the most public brain fade in sports history. The mistake was so humiliating that he was sent home from the tournament immediately, proving that even at the elite level, sometimes the pressure makes you forget how to count to 2. Delroy Facey. Delroy Facey was a familiar face in English football, a powerful striker who played in the Premier League for Bolton Wanderers and had a long career with clubs like West Bromwich Albion and Hull City. However, after his playing days faded, he struggled to replace the income of a top-flight athlete. In 2013, an investigation by the National Crime Agency exposed him as the middleman in a match-fixing syndicate. Facey was caught urging non-league players to throw matches in exchange for cash, telling a contact that lower league teams were easy to corrupt. In April 2015, the Birmingham Crown Court found him guilty of conspiracy to bribe. The judge stated that Facey's actions struck at the very heart of football and sentenced him to 2.5 years in prison. He served his time but emerged as a disgraced figure. The conviction made him the highest profile player in the UK to be jailed for match fixing, transforming him from a respected journeyman into the face of corruption in the English game. Liverpool versus Barcelona. Anfield has witnessed miracles, but the 79th minute of the 2019 semi-final felt less like a miracle and more like a tactical ambush. Barcelona, led by Lionel Messi, were footballing royalty. They were seasoned, cynical, and leading the tie comfortably just days prior. With the aggregate score tied at 3-3, the match paused for a corner kick. In the rhythm of professional football, this is a moment for defenders to organise, catch their breath, and reset the structure. The Barcelona defence turned their backs, expecting the referee's whistle or a substitution. They simply switched off. Then Alexander-Arnold spotted the opening. Trent Alexander-Arnold, walking away from the corner flag, sensed the anomaly. He spun back, striking the ball before the broadcast cameras could even track the movement. Divock Origi, standing entirely alone in the 6-yard box, swept the ball home. The stadium didn't erupt immediately. It gasped. Was it legal? Had the referee blown his whistle? The Barcelona players stood frozen, arms raised in a collective gesture of confusion, looking less like elite athletes and more like confused bystanders. To dismantle the greatest team in the world, not with a thunderbolt strike, but with a moment of schoolyard trickery, shattered the seriousness of the competition. It stands as the most surreal, cheeky, and devastating goal in Champions League history, a moment where an entire defence simply switched off for 2 fatal seconds. Mexico City, 1986. In criminal forensics, the most damaging evidence is often hidden in plain sight. In football, that evidence was a fist raised above a head in Mexico City, 1986. The quarter-final between Argentina and England produced the most analysed frame in sporting history, the hand of God. The official report lists the goal as a header, but biomechanical analysis proves this is a physical impossibility. To generate power on a header, the neck muscles contract and the head snaps forward. Diego Maradona's head did not move in that manner. Instead, the footage clearly shows his left arm extending, with his fist punching the ball past Peter Shilton. The physics of the ball's trajectory looping unnaturally over the keeper confirms manual impact rather than cranial contact. Referee Ali bin Nasser claimed his view was obstructed, which is plausible. However, the linesman, Bogdan Dorchev, had a perpendicular view of the incident. In a high-stakes environment like the World Cup, the failure of 2 officials to spot a handball that was visible to 114,000 people in the stadium suggests a catastrophic breakdown of the officiating system. Was it fear of the volatile atmosphere or willful blindness? The forensic truth is simple. A volleyball spike eliminated a nation, and the record books still refuse to correct the error. The stolen identity. Following the conclusion of the 2015 to 2016 campaign, Anthony Martial established himself as a central figure within the Manchester United squad. The French forward finished the season as the club's top scorer and held the number 9 jersey, a designation traditionally reserved for the team's primary centre-forward. His standing appeared secure until the organisation signed Zlatan Ibrahimovic In July 2016, the arrival of the Swedish veteran precipitated an immediate and controversial administrative decision regarding squad allocations. Manchester United management unilaterally assigned the number 9 shirt to Ibrahimovic. Multiple reports indicated that the club executed this transfer without consulting Martial or offering a negotiation period. The forward allegedly discovered the loss of his number through the club's public social media announcement rather than via internal communication. The mandate forced Martial to vacate the position and switch to number 11. This alteration carried specific commercial consequences, as it compelled him to abandon his personal AM9 branding strategy just as it launched. Martial's agent publicly criticised the methodology, labelling the decision disrespectful and hurtful to the player. The incident illustrated a distinct prioritisation of commercial impact over squad seniority. By stripping the team's leading scorer of his number to accommodate a marquee free agent, the administration demonstrated that the marketing potential of Ibrahimovic superseded Martial's contributions. The decision created a lingering friction that characterised the remainder of Martial's tenure at Old Trafford. Peter Swan. Peter Swan was a defensive giant for Sheffield Wednesday and an England international who had played at the 1962 World Cup. He was at the peak of his career in 1964 when the Sunday People newspaper broke the biggest scandal in English football history. Swan, along with teammates Tony Kay and David Lane, was accused of betting against his own team in a match against Ipswich Town back in 1962. They had bet on Ipswich to win, ensuring a profit when Wednesday lost 2-0. The legal and professional consequences were catastrophic. In 1965, at Nottingham Assizes, Swan was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 4 months in prison. The judge stated they had polluted the game. Far worse than the jail time was the FA's punishment, a lifetime ban from football. Swan spent his prime years selling cars and running a pub. Labelled a cheat, remarkably, the ban was lifted in 1972, allowing him to return to Sheffield Wednesday at age 36, but he had lost the best 8 years of his career to a £100 bet. The Remontada. The premise of this quarter-final was a formality. Barcelona had won the first leg 4-1. They possessed Lionel Messi and a 3-goal cushion. No team overcomes that deficit against Barcelona. The Stadio Olimpico was half expecting a training exercise, but from the first whistle, Roma played with a manic, suicidal intensity that unsettled the Spanish giants. Dzeko scored early, then De Rossi converted a penalty, 2-0. The atmosphere shifted from hope to a terrifying belief. The impossible became reality in the 82nd minute. Barcelona, usually the masters of time and space, looked paralysed, completely unable to cope with the pressure. A corner kick was whipped in, and Kostas Manolas, a defender, glanced a header into the far post. The commentary from Peter Drury captured the surrealism. Roma have risen from their ruins. Manolas, the Greek god in Rome. The camera showed Messi standing in the centre circle, staring blankly, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Barcelona had been effectively bullied out of the competition by a team that refused to accept the mathematical reality of the scoreline. It was a night where sheer will dismantled superior talent, a 3-0 victory that felt like a hallucination for anyone watching. Barcelona, PSG, they call it La Remontada. But if you ask anyone from Paris, it wasn't a comeback. It was a straight-up heist. Barcelona was dead. They were destroyed 4-0 in the first leg, and the world wrote them off. But the organisers knew a Champions League without Messi and Neymar in February is a financial nightmare. So suddenly the narrative shifted. We didn't get a fair fight, we got the rescue. The officiating was beyond suspicious. Referee Denis Aitekin made calls that defied explanation. Mascherano blatantly tackled Di Maria in the box, a clear penalty that would have ended the tie instantly. Aitekin looked right at it and gave nothing. Then Luis Suárez feels a phantom touch, drops like he's been shot, and the whistle blows immediately. Penalty. Neymar goes down later with minimal contact. Another penalty. It was absurd. Every single critical decision went Barcelona's way. The statistical probability of that happening by chance is 0. Fans were furious because it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a script, a 6-1 turnaround, prints money, It sells documentaries, excitement, and highlights for decades. A boring exit for a super club, that's worthless to the stakeholders. This wasn't football magic, it was the industry protecting its biggest asset. PSG wasn't just playing a team, they were playing the business model, and they never stood a chance. Michael Johnson, the star who chose silence. In 2007, Michael Johnson was widely considered the future of the English national team. Sven-Göran Eriksson famously described him as the complete midfielder, and for a brief window at Manchester City, he looked the part. He was dynamic, powerful, and technically gifted the jewel of the academy. But while the expectations were sky high, Johnson was quietly falling apart. Recurring abdominal injuries kept him off the pitch, but the real damage was invisible. The toxic environment of professional football, the intense scrutiny and constant pressure triggered severe mental health struggles. He later admitted that he was trapped in a life he didn't want, playing a role that made him miserable. By 2012, at just 24, he walked away. He didn't announce a retirement tour, he simply disappeared. When a photo surfaced years later showing him looking unfit, the tabloids were cruel, branding him a waste of talent. They missed the point entirely. Johnson eventually broke his silence to reveal that leaving football was a survival decision. He traded the Premier League lifestyle for peace of mind. He remains one of English football's great what-ifs, not because he failed, but because he realised that the cost of stardom was his own sanity.